We as F1 fans are in a pretty good time of the sport. For us, it is normal to get live footage in HD quality on TV every 2 or 3 weeks. But this wasn't always the case. And so, I want to take you on a journey of the development of F1 onboard cameras through the years. And one thing before we start, if you like this content and want to support me as a creator, then consider subscribing to not miss out on any future videos. And with that, I would say we start the journey of onboard cameras in F1 in the 1950s. And here in these first years in Formula 1, getting actual onboard footage from an F1 car was really hard to get because video cameras back then were heavy and large and there were no constructions in order to fit these properly onto the car. And because no one had really tried something like this before, the engineers and the videographers at the time went to the strategy of trial and error to find a way to make it possible. And this approach would lead to certain, well, rather unconventional solutions where a cameraman was tied onto the front of the car in order to get the perfect angle of the driver while he was driving the car. Thankfully, this didn't become the standard, and so instead, frames made out of metal tubes, wood or other material were used to fit the first versions of onboard cameras. But these were never used in official events, but rather in private sessions from the teams where a driver would take the car out for a few laps in order to get some good footage. However, the 1960s saw the first tries to use onboard cameras during race weekends. A big influence here was the movie Grand Prix. It showed what was possible in terms of filming a moving vehicle, and it also influenced the later form of onboard cameras. For the first time, you could see a completely new and more dramatic impression of the race, because before that, the only two options of seeing a Formula 1 car in action is either as a spectator during a race weekend, or by getting into it yourself and driving it around a circuit. However, the cameras of the time were still not made for moving on a fast-moving vehicle like an F1 car, and so improvisation was the daily business for the filmmakers. And one of the cameras that was used for most of the shots was the Super Panavision 70. It was very expensive, which made it pretty hard to convince the owner of one to mount it onto a Formula 1 car, and also pretty heavy, which was not good for the Formula 1 drivers as well, because they didn't want to have a heavy object on them which would slow them down during the lap. For example, Phil Hill's car was fitted with a camera for the 1964 Monaco Grand Prix and was 10 seconds slower than the previous year's pole lap. Unfortunately, the evolution of F1 onboard cameras in the 1970s stagnated somewhat. This was because the engineers were mainly focusing on the cars itself, because the 1970s were the time of evolution in terms of engineering and design, instead of focusing on the camera technologies itself. And so onboard cameras couldn't keep up with the speed with which F1 cars became more robust and complex machineries. They basically experienced the same thing as the safety standards in F1 at the time, because they also couldn't keep up with the speed of the new cars. So the RTD camera technology was only used on F1 cars for institutional or promotional videos during private sessions. However, there were still a few experiments with the technology. For example, in 1978, Jackie Stewart led the formation lap of the French Grand Prix that year with a special Renault car that had fitted an onboard camera onto the nose, which could film an entire lap before the race started. Bear in mind, this stunt was not communicated with the FIA, and no studio supported them during this action. Another experiment was done 1 year later by Derek Daly, as one of the first tries to go into the direction of helmet cameras in F1. This first version was scrapped after a few tries, however, due to electrical problems. The next time we would see some experiments with helmet cameras in F1 would be in 2021, with Fernando Alonso using it during a practice session. But when the 1980s roll around, it was clear that Formula 1 had to do something about onboard cameras, because while events like the Bathurst 1000 or the Indy 500 had cars with live cam links, F1 still didn't have a proper system for onboard cameras, so they had to find ways to record onboard footage from the cars in order to not fall back too far. I mean, after all, they were still the pinnacle of motorsport, with the best engineers and the most advanced technology. And in 1982, Dennis Johnson, a well-known sports video producer, was granted by Bernie Ecclestone to test TV cameras with live links. Bernie also opened the doors to Brabham, as he was still the owner of the team at the time, to give Johnson a base for his first tests. And 1 year later, a first prototype was presented. It weighed over 7 kilos and was mounted to the top air intake, with the live signal transmitter being fitted to the underside of the car in front of the right radiator air intake. The first one to test it was Nelson Piquet, but the Brabham team never adopted it due to financial and political reasons. After this, Johnson transferred his knowledge to Renault, which were interested in continuing the experiments with the French tech company Thomson, as they saw the enormous potential of the technology in the next few years. Renault presented a refined version in 1985, which was mounted to the right side air intake with a camera array for this year's German Grand Prix. François Hollot had the honor to be the first driver to send out live footage from an F1 car during the Grand Prix weekend. And even though he had to retire on lap 8 due to gearbox problems, this was a historical moment for F1. The technology got better in the next few years, especially in the 1990s. This was the time of major technological developments in F1, which also affected the production of live content from F1 cars. Cameras progressively shrinked in size and improved the quality of production as F1 started its move from analog to digital. This allowed cameras to be fitted in more creative and efficient ways, such as the side of the air intake or the rear wing. The next step came in 1995, when teams like Ferrari and McLaren used a new way of placing the camera above the driver's head in a new way. This I-shaped camera provided an excellent vantage point while also minimally affecting the aero drag. The form later became the well-known T-cam, which we know from modern production. And from 1999 onwards, all cars had to fit the T-cam. As before, some teams had used dummies because there were not enough video recorders to equip all cars. Since then, the quality of the T-cam became better and better with HD and 4K resolution. But only because the T-cam seems to have reached its limit, it doesn't mean that there has been no development in the field of onboard cameras during the years. Over the years, we got a lot of new angles from an F1 car, such as a rear-warded one from the T-cam, a shoulder cam, a both-side nose cam, a halo cam, a steering wheel cam, a 360-degree cam, and a visor cam. And especially the visor cam is one of the newest innovations in that field. It has a diameter of 8mm, weighs only 2.5 grams, and is mounted on the right inside of the driver's helmet. This allows F1 to get completely new angles from the race, not only for TV, but also for social media. But not every camera on the car is used for live TV, such as the halo cam or the 360-degree cam, which are only used for non-live video formats. And the newest development of F1 onboard cameras are gyrocams. Together with a series of G-force sensors, a pre-programmed circuit, and a manually controlled tilt, the camera simulates the variations to create a more immersive shot for the viewer. But there's one thing I'd like to talk about, because it was the main reason for this video, and that is the new camera Apple built to record some shots of the new F1 movie. The goal of the producers was to get some real race scenes, but they couldn't mount some heavy camera gear on one of the driver's cars, nor could they send in an extra car to record some scenes. So they had to find a way in order to get their hands on actual race footage. And that is where the expertise of the iPhone comes into play, because what Apple did is they took a modern iPhone, stripped it down to only the necessary parts for the camera to work, and put it inside of the shape of one of the side mounts of the T-cam. But how can they put their self-designed camera on one of the T-cams of the real cars? I mean, isn't that already used by F1? Well, not always. You see, F1 doesn't place this type of camera on all cars during a race weekend. F1 only places them on certain cars of which they think they might produce good material during the weekend, such as a local driver or the championship contenders. And to not give the other cars an unfair advantage, they have to use a weight with the same shape of the actual module. So what the producers did is they asked if they could replace one of these weights with their camera. And because it was produced in the same way as the real camera modules from F1, the FIA approved it, and the producers could get actual race footage from an F1 Grand Prix. All they had to do was to just post-edit the delivery of the car to the one of Apex GP. And to be honest, I didn't know that Apple had done something like this to get footage for the movie. It just shows how far we've come in terms of technological development. I mean, Apple is able to put this technology into devices we use every day, but also the development of cameras in F1, not only on board, is fascinating. We're able to see races from new angles and with better quality than ever before, and I personally can't wait for the development in that area in the future. So let me know in the comments down below what you think of F1 onboard cameras and what your favorite angle from the race is. Thank you for watching, feel free to subscribe, and until then, I'll see you next time.